The blood-red sun hung low over the jagged peaks of the Cascade Mountains, as Penelope Vail clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, the bitter October wind cutting through her like a knife. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, a small bundle of meager possessions, and the crushing realization that she had been abandoned in this wilderness to die. Spokane, Washington Territory, 1875. Penelope's tears had long since dried on her cheeks as she trudged up the winding mountain path. The memory of Terrence's sneering face as he drove away in their wagon still burned in her mind. 6 months of marriage had revealed his true character: a gambler, a liar, and now, it seemed, a would-be murderer. He'd brought her to this remote mountain pass under the pretense of starting a new life, only to leave her with nothing while he absconded with her family's money and the last of their supplies. 2 days' walk to the nearest settlement, he'd called back mockingly. Best hurry before the snow comes, Penny. The cruel laughter had echoed through the trees as his wagon disappeared down the mountainside. She'd stood frozen in disbelief until the sound of wheels on stone faded into silence. That had been this morning. Now, as dusk approached and the temperature dropped, panic began to set in. The mountains were already showing signs of the coming winter frost gathering on the ground each morning, the wildlife growing scarce as animals prepared for hibernation. She had heard stories of early blizzards burying these passes under 10 feet of snow. Out here, alone and unprepared, she wouldn't survive such a storm. Penelope paused at a ridge, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The valley below stretched endlessly, a vast expanse of pine and fir trees darkening as night approached. In the distance, a thin wisp of smoke rose from the tree line. Her heart leaped: civilization, perhaps, or at least another human soul. With renewed determination, she began her descent, picking her way carefully down the rocky slope. The forest grew denser as she reached the valley floor, the towering pines blocking what little daylight remained. The smoke seemed closer now, though the trees obscured its source. "Hello." She called out, her voice sounding small in the vastness of the forest. "Is anyone there?" Only the whisper of wind through the pines answered her. Penelope pushed forward, following the scent of wood smoke that now mingled with the sharp pine. After another half-hour of walking, she stumbled into a small clearing where a campfire burned low. Beside it sat a man, his back to her as he tended to something in a cast iron pot. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quavering. The man whirled around, hand dropping instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Penelope froze, raising her hands slightly. "I mean no harm," she said quickly. "I'm lost and in need of help." The stranger studied her for a long moment. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years outdoors. His face was partially obscured by a well-trimmed beard, but she could see sharp, assessing eyes taking in her disheveled appearance. He wore the practical garb of a frontiersman: worn denim pants, a flannel shirt beneath a leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that now sat beside him on a log. "Most folks don't wander these mountains alone as winter's setting in," he said finally, his deep voice carrying a hint of a southern drawl. "Especially not a lady in city clothes." Penelope swallowed hard. "I didn't choose to be here. I was left." Something in her tone must have conveyed the gravity of her situation, for the man's expression softened slightly. He gestured to the log across from him. "Name's Ryder Wells," he said, turning back to stir whatever was cooking in his pot. "Coffee's hot and stew's nearly done. Best sit and warm yourself while you explain how you came to be abandoned in my corner of nowhere." Relief flooded through her as she sank onto the offered seat. The heat from the fire immediately began to thaw her frozen fingers, and the aroma of the stew made her stomach growl embarrassingly loud. "Penelope Vail," she offered in return. "Though I suppose it's Penelope Hastings now, not that the name means much anymore." Ryder raised an eyebrow but said nothing, simply ladling stew into a tin bowl and handing it to her with a spoon. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting the food gratefully. The first bite nearly brought tears to her eyes: simple venison stew with wild onions and potatoes, but to her famished body, it was a feast fit for royalty. "Your husband left you here." Ryder asked bluntly after she'd eaten a few bites. Penelope nodded, the shame of it burning in her chest. We were traveling from Portland to start a new life, or so he claimed. Turns out he just wanted my family's money. Once he had gambled and drunk that away, I was just a burden. She stared into the fire. This morning, he simply drove away, leaving me with nothing but the clothes I'm wearing. Ryder's expression darkened. Some men don't deserve the title. He poured coffee into a tin cup and passed it to her. The nearest town is Spokane Falls, and it's a good 40 miles from here. Dangerous country between, especially for someone unprepared. Penelope's hands trembled around the warm cup. Is there a stage that passes through? Perhaps I could, not until spring, Ryder cut in gently. First snow's likely just days away. Once it starts, these passes won't clear until April, maybe May. The reality of her situation came crashing down on her. Abandoned, miles from civilization, with winter bearing down, she had escaped one death only to face another. What will I do? She whispered, more to herself than to him. Ryder studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Then he sighed, a decision seeming to settle in his features. I've been planning to winter up here, he said slowly. Got a good spot picked out, plenty of game, was going to build a cabin starting tomorrow. He hesitated. It won't be fancy, but it'll keep the cold out. You're welcome to stay until spring thaw makes travel possible again. Penelope stared at him, searching for any sign of deception or ill intent, remembering all too well how Terence had seemed kind at first. But all she saw was straightforward honesty in Ryder's weathered face. Why would you help me? She asked cautiously. Ryder shrugged, looking almost uncomfortable with the question. My ma raised me to believe you don't leave folks to die when you can help them, especially not a woman alone. He poked at the fire with a stick. I've got the supplies and skills to keep us both alive through winter. Don't seem right to do otherwise. Penelope weighed her options, though in truth she had none. Stay with this stranger or face certain death in the wilderness. I can work, she offered, desperate not to be merely a charity case. I can cook, and so I'm stronger than I look. A ghost of a smile touched Ryder's lips. I don't doubt it, Mrs. Hastings. You'd have to be to make it this far on your own. He glanced at the darkening sky. It's settled then. We'll start on the cabin at first light. That night, Penelope slept wrapped in a wool blanket Ryder had provided, closer to the fire than him. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. Every snapping twig in the forest made her start, wondering if Terence had returned to finish what he'd started, or if some wild animal was stalking the camp. But each time she opened her eyes, she saw Ryder sitting alert, rifle across his lap, keeping watch. By morning, she had made her peace with the arrangement. This stranger was her only chance of survival, and something in his steady gaze told her he could be trusted at least more than the husband who had left her to die. As the first light of dawn filtered through the pines, Ryder was already up, stoking the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of coffee and johnny cakes. Hope you're ready for hard work, he said, handing her a plate. We've got a cabin to build before the snow flies. Penelope squared her shoulders and met his gaze directly. Just tell me what to do, Mr. Wells. For the first time, she saw a genuine smile cross his face, transforming his stern features. Ryder will do just fine, madam. We're going to be sharing close quarters for some months after all. Penelope nodded, a strange mix of trepidation and determination settling in her chest. Then I insist you call me Penelope. With breakfast finished, Ryder led her deeper into the forest, to a small clearing nestled against a rock face that would shelter them from the northern winds. A stream gurgled nearby, and the surrounding trees would provide both building material and firewood. It's perfect, she breathed, seeing the potential of the spot. Been scouting it for weeks, Ryder admitted, dropping his pack and surveying the area with practiced eyes. Good water, natural windbreak, plenty of game trails nearby. He pointed to the far side of the clearing. Cabin will go there. Won't be fancy, one room, maybe 16 by 20 feet. Dirt floor at first, though we can add planking later if time allows. The next days passed in a blur of exhausting labor. Ryder felled trees with his axe while teaching Penelope how to strip branches and bark. Her soft hands blistered and bled until he fashioned her crude gloves from deer hide. Every muscle in her body ached, but she refused to complain. This work meant survival. Ryder proved to be a skilled builder, having constructed cabins before during his years as a trapper and scout. He showed her how to notch the logs so they would interlock at the corners, creating a sturdy structure without nails. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire, both too exhausted to do more than stare into the flames. "Necessity, mostly," he replied, whittling at a piece of wood. "Spent 5 years with my pa in the mountains of Colorado before the war. He was a fur trapper. Taught me how to live off the land, build shelter, track game." A shadow crossed his face. "Lost him to a grizzly when I was 16. Been on my own since." "I'm sorry," Penelope said softly. Ryder shrugged. "It was a long time ago." He glanced at her. "What about you? How does a lady with hands soft as yours end up married to the kind of man who'd leave her to die in the wilderness?" Penelope stared into the fire. "My father was a merchant in Portland, successful enough that we lived comfortably, but not wealthy by any means. When he died 2 years ago, I was left with a modest inheritance and few prospects." She sighed. "Terrence seemed charming, educated, said he had plans to start a business in the East. I was 23, considered nearly a spinster already. He offered escape from spinsterhood and a fresh start. And instead took your money and abandoned you," Ryder finished grimly. "Yes," she whispered. "I was a fool." "No," Ryder said firmly. "You were betrayed. There's a difference." His words offered a strange comfort. For months, she had blamed herself for not seeing through Terrence's facade. Perhaps there was truth in what Ryder said. Trust wasn't foolishness, but betrayal of that trust was villainy. By the end of the first week, the cabin walls had reached waist height. Ryder worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, his powerful shoulders and arms driving the axe with precision born of years of experience. Penelope found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, admiring not just his physical strength, but the quiet competence with which he approached every task. The first snowfall came earlier than expected, just light flurries that melted by midday, but a warning nonetheless. "We need to push harder," Ryder said that evening. "I've seen storms roll in without warning this time of year. We need walls and a roof within the week." True to his word, Ryder redoubled his efforts the next day. Penelope worked alongside him, learning quickly and doing whatever she could to speed their progress. By the 5th day, the walls stood complete, and Ryder began work on the roof, a simple structure of split logs covered with layers of pine boughs for insulation. "It'll leak," he warned her, "but we can improve it as winter progresses. Main thing is getting us closed in against the cold." On the 10th day, as Penelope returned from the stream with water, she paused at the edge of the clearing and felt her breath catch. There stood a cabin, crude and simple, but unmistakably a home. Smoke curled from the stone chimney Ryder had constructed on the final days, and the small window openings, now covered with oiled deerskin, glowed with the warm light from within. Ryder emerged from the doorway, wiping his hands on his pants. "Well, what do you think?" he asked, a rare note of uncertainty in his voice. Tears sprang to Penelope's eyes. "It's wonderful," she whispered. "I never thought. I was certain I would die out here." "Not on my watch," Ryder said firmly. "Come on in, got a surprise for you." Curious, Penelope followed him inside. The interior was simple, a dirt floor, the log walls still oozing sap in places, but Ryder had been busy. A crude bed frame stood in one corner, filled with pine boughs and covered with furs. A similar but smaller structure occupied the opposite corner. Between them, a table made of split logs stood near the stone fireplace where a cheerful fire burned. "You made furniture," she marveled. "Can't have you sleeping on the ground all winter," he replied, seeming embarrassed by her reaction. "It's not much, but it's perfect," she interrupted. "Truly, Ryder, I don't know how to thank you." He cleared his throat. "No need for thanks. We've still got work ahead. Need to smoke meat for winter stores, gather more firewood, set traps. Winter up here is no easy thing." That night, as Penelope lay in her new bed, listening to Ryder's steady breathing from across the room, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Perhaps she would survive this after all. The real winter arrived 3 days later. Penelope awoke to an eerie silence, the usual forest sounds muffled. Light filtering through the oiled deerskin windows had a strange quality, brighter yet softer than normal. She rose and moved to the door, opening it to a world transformed. Snow blanketed everything, at least 2 feet deep and still falling in fat, silent flakes. The trees bowed under the weight, creating a cathedral of white. It was breathtakingly beautiful and terrifying all at once. "First big snow," Ryder said behind her, "earlier than usual." "Good thing we finished when we did." Penelope nodded, unable to tear her eyes from the transformed landscape. "It's beautiful, deadly beautiful," Ryder corrected gently. "This is just the beginning. By January, we could have drifts taller than the cabin in places." He moved past her to check their woodpile, now partially buried. "We need more wood. I'll start cutting today." "I'll help," Penelope insisted. Ryder gave her an appraising look, then nodded. "Bundle up. Frostbite takes fingers quick out here." Life settled into a rhythm dictated by survival. Mornings began before dawn, with Ryder stoking the fire while Penelope prepared a simple breakfast. Then came the daily chores, hauling water from the now partially frozen stream, checking the snares Ryder had set for rabbits and grouse, splitting and stacking wood. Despite the harshness of their circumstances, Penelope found herself adapting. Her hands grew calloused, her arms stronger. She learned to skin rabbits without wasting meat, to preserve berries she'd gathered before the snow, to mend clothes with sinew thread. The cabin, small as it was, became a haven against the howling winds and deepening snow. At night, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. Ryder taught her to carve wood, and she fashioned crude spoons and bowls to replace the tin ones they'd been using. "You have a talent for it," he commented one evening, examining a spoon she had just completed. Penelope felt a rush of pleasure at the compliment. "I always enjoyed working with my hands. Father thought it unladylike, but Mother encouraged me." She smiled at the memory. "She taught me to sew and cook when the servants weren't looking." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Penelope agreed softly. "She died when I was 16, consumption." Ryder nodded sympathetically. "My own mother passed when I was just a boy." Barely remember her face now, though I recall she sang beautifully. These quiet exchanges became precious to Penelope. Each small revelation about Ryder painted a picture of a man shaped by hardship, yet untainted by bitterness. He had fought briefly in the war between the states, though he spoke little of it. Afterward, he'd worked as a scout for wagon trains, then as a hunter supplying meat to mining camps. The last few years he'd spent trapping and trading, saving money to eventually buy land of his own. Why here? She asked one stormy night as wind rattled the shutters Ryder had crafted for the windows. So far from everything, Ryder stared into the fire for a long moment. "After the war, I found I couldn't stomach crowds anymore. Too much noise, too many people asking questions I didn't want to answer." He poked at the embers. "Out here, a man can breathe, can hear himself think." "Don't you get lonely?" He glanced at her, then back to the fire. "Used to think solitude was what I wanted. Now I'm not so sure." As December deepened, the temperature plummeted. Snow piled higher around the cabin, and Ryder had to dig a path to the woodpile each morning. Inside, they hung furs over the door and windows for added insulation, and Penelope used rendered fat to seal gaps between the logs where wind whistled through. One particularly brutal night, the temperature dropped so low that the water bucket inside the cabin froze solid. They huddled near the fire, wrapped in every fur they possessed, and still the cold seemed to penetrate to their bones. "It'll pass," Ryder assured her, his breath visible even indoors. "Storm like this burns itself out quick." Penelope nodded, teeth chattering too hard to speak. Despite the roaring fire, she couldn't seem to get warm. Hours passed, and the wind only howled louder, finding every crack and crevice in their shelter. "This isn't working," Ryder finally said, his face tight with concern as he watched her shivering form. "Your lips are turning blue." Before she could respond, he moved to his bed, stripping the furs from it and bringing them to where she sat. "Body heat," he explained gruffly. "Only way to survive nights like this. I'll keep my distance as much as possible." Under any other circumstances, Penelope might have protested, but survival trumped propriety, and she was too cold to argue. She nodded, making room for him beneath the pile of furs. Ryder settled beside her, his large frame radiating heat. Tentatively, he placed an arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "Better?" he asked, his voice strangely tight. It was. The warmth of his body began to seep into hers, and gradually the violent shivering subsided. "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you." They sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind's mournful wail. Penelope became intensely aware of his proximity, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the rough texture of his flannel shirt against her cheek, the clean, masculine scent of him mingled with wood smoke. "Tell me about Portland," Ryder said suddenly, breaking the charged silence. "Been through once or twice, but never stayed long." Grateful for the distraction, Penelope began describing her hometown, the bustling port, the grand houses on the hill, the muddy streets that never seemed to dry completely in the damp climate. Ryder listened attentively, asking questions that kept her talking until her eyelids grew heavy. She must have dozed off, for she woke to find herself still nestled against Ryder's side, his arm a protective weight around her shoulders. The storm had passed, and pale morning light filtered through the window coverings. For a long moment she remained still, reluctant to break the peaceful cocoon of warmth. Ryder stirred, his eyes opening to find her watching him. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of boundaries crossed and new territory entered. "Storms past," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Yes," she replied softly, neither moved for several heartbeats. Then, as if by mutual agreement, they slowly disentangled themselves. The moment broken but not forgotten. Christmas approached, though without calendars, they had to estimate the date. Penelope had been keeping track of days by making small marks on a piece of bark, and by her reckoning, December 24th arrived clear and brutally cold. "Should we mark the occasion somehow?" she asked tentatively, as they finished a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of the honey. Ryder looked surprised, hadn't thought about it, never been one for celebrating much. "We could have a special dinner," Penelope suggested. "Perhaps you could hunt something fresh. I've been saving a few dried apples and some cinnamon for a special occasion." A slow smile spread across Ryder's face. "Venison stew with apple pie sounds like a fine Christmas to me." He set out after breakfast, rifle in hand. Penelope busied herself cleaning the cabin and preparing what she could for their feast. She had become adept at cooking over the open fire, learning to control temperature by moving pots closer or farther from the flames. When Ryder returned mid-afternoon, he carried not only a dressed rabbit, but also a small pine sapling. "Thought we might need this," he said, looking almost sheepish as he set the little tree in a corner of the cabin. "My mother always insisted on having one, even during the lean years." Penelope felt a surge of emotion at the gesture. "It's perfect," she said, voice thick. "I have just the things to decorate it." While Ryder prepared the rabbit, she worked on the tree, fashioning simple ornaments from pine cones, bits of colored thread from her unraveled shawl, and feathers she'd collected. The result was humble but charming, a bright spot of celebration in their rustic home. That evening, they feasted on rabbit stew, savoring every bite of fresh meat. Afterward, Penelope proudly presented her apple pie, more of a cobbler really, cooked in a cast iron skillet, but the aroma of cinnamon and baked apples filled the cabin with a warmth that went beyond physical heat. "This is wonderful," Ryder said after his first bite, genuine appreciation in his eyes. "Can't remember the last time I had something this good." "It was my mother's recipe," Penelope admitted, though she would hardly recognize it without proper flour and butter. They sat by the fire long after the meal was finished, sharing stories of Christmases past. Ryder spoke of holidays spent in mining camps, of the surprising generosity of rough men far from home. Penelope described elaborate dinners and church services in Portland, the carolers who would travel from house to house. "I have something for you," Ryder said suddenly, rising to retrieve something from his pack. Penelope watched curiously as he returned with a small object wrapped in a piece of deerskin. "It's not much," he said, holding it out to her. "Made it during those times you went gathering kindling." With trembling fingers, Penelope unwrapped the gift. Inside lay a wooden comb, intricately carved with a pattern of small flowers along the spine. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each tooth perfectly formed, the whole piece polished to a soft gleam. "Ryder," she breathed, running her fingers over the delicate carving. "It's beautiful." He shrugged, clearly embarrassed by her reaction. "Noticed yours broke a few weeks back. Thought you might need a new one." The thoughtfulness of the gift moved her deeply. That he had noticed such a detail and spent precious hours crafting a replacement spoke volumes. "I have something for you as well," she admitted, retrieving a package from beneath her bed. "Though it's not nearly as fine as your gift." Ryder unwrapped the bundle to find a pair of leather gloves, painstakingly stitched from scraps of deer hide. "I noticed your old ones were wearing through at the fingertips," she explained. "These aren't perfect, but they should be warmer." Ryder pulled them on, flexing his fingers. "They fit just right," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "Thank you, Penelope." Their eyes met across the fire, and something shifted between them. No longer were they merely two strangers thrown together by circumstance. Over these weeks of shared hardship and simple joys, they had become something more, friends, perhaps, or something deeper still. January brought the harshest, weather yet blizzards that lasted days, temperatures so low that Ryder no longer ventured far from the cabin. They rationed their food carefully, aware that winter was far from over. On the worst days, they remained indoors, conserving energy and sharing the single bed for warmth, though always with a respectful distance maintained. It was during one of these storms that Penelope fell ill. At first, it seemed a simple cold, a scratchy throat, a slight cough. But by the second day, fever set in, and her cough deepened into something that rattled her chest painfully with each breath. Ryder watched her with growing concern. "My mother used to make a tea for chest coughs," he said, feeling her forehead with a gentle hand. "Pine needles and honey. Not pleasant, but it helps." He braved the storm to gather fresh pine, then boiled the needles with the last of their precious honey. Penelope drank the bitter concoction obediently, too weak to protest. For 3 days, her condition worsened. The fever burned hot, leaving her alternately shivering and sweating. Ryder barely slept, constantly at her side, coaxing water between her cracked lips, applying cool cloths to her forehead, and feeding the fire to keep the cabin warm. In her delirium, Penelope spoke of things long past her mother's death, her father's business failures, Terrence's betrayal. Ryder listened to it all, his face grim as he pieced together the full extent of the hardships she had endured even before being abandoned in the wilderness. On the 4th night, when her fever peaked and her breathing became shallow and labored, Ryder did something he hadn't done since childhood. He prayed. "Don't take her," he whispered fiercely to the cabin's shadows. "Not when she's finally finding her strength." "Not when I'm just beginning to," he broke off, unable to voice the emotion that had been growing within him for weeks. Whether by divine intervention or simply the natural course of the illness, Penelope's fever broke before dawn. Ryder, dozing in a chair beside her bed, woke to find her watching him with clear eyes. "You look terrible," she whispered, her voice hoarse but aware. A laugh, half-sob, escaped him. "You're one to talk," he replied, relief making his voice unsteady. "You took care of me," she said, reaching weakly for his hand. Ryder took it, his large fingers gentle around hers. "Course I did. Couldn't let you die after all the work we put into this cabin, now could I?" The jest didn't mask the emotion in his eyes. Something had changed during those desperate days of her illness, a barrier broken, a truth acknowledged. Penelope's recovery was slow. For days, she remained weak, able to do little more than sit by the fire wrapped in furs. Ryder took over all the chores without complaint, bringing her books he'd had in his packed dog-eared volumes of Emerson and Thoreau that had been his companions on many solitary nights. "These were my father's," he explained when she commented on the philosophical nature of his reading material. "He had little formal education but a hunger for ideas, said a man who stops learning might as well stop breathing." "He sounds like a wise man," Penelope said, carefully turning the pages of Walden. "He was," Ryder agreed, a rare wistfulness in his tone. "Think he would have liked you." The comment, casually made as he skinned a rabbit, sent a warm flush through Penelope that had nothing to do with her recovering health. By February, Penelope had regained most of her strength. The worst of winter still held the mountains in its grip, but they had settled into a comfortable routine. Their food stores remained adequate, supplemented by riders hunting on clear days. They worked together to improve the cabin, adding a floor of split logs, crafting better shutters for the windows, even constructing a small shelf for their few books and personal items. The close quarters had ceased to feel constraining. Instead, the cabin had become a sanctuary, not just from the elements but from the complications of the outside world. Here, they were simply Ryder and Penelope, a man and a woman, learning each other's habits and histories, sharing work and simple pleasures. One evening, as they sat by the fire working on their respective tasks, Ryder repairing a snowshoe, Penelope mending a shirt, a comfortable silence enveloped them. Penelope found herself watching his hands, strong and capable, yet surprisingly gentle in their movements. Without thinking, she spoke the question that had been in her mind for weeks. "Why didn't you ever marry?" Ryder's hands stilled on his work. For a moment, she thought he might not answer. "Came close once," he finally said, not looking up. "Before the war. Sarah was her name. Father owned the general store in a little town outside Denver." He fell silent again, and Penelope waited, sensing there was more to the story. "I went off to fight, promised to return and marry her. By the time I came back, she'd wed a banker who hadn't gone to war." His voice held no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance. "Can't blame her. 3 years is a long time to wait with no certainty of return." "I'm sorry," Penelope said softly. Ryder shrugged. "It was for the best. After the war, I wasn't the same man who'd left. Took me years to find my footing again." He glanced up at her. "What about you? How did you end up with a man like Terrence?" Penelope sighed, setting aside her mending. "After my father died, there weren't many options for me. I had enough money to live modestly for a time, but no real skills beyond those of a merchant's daughter." She gave a rueful smile. "How different things might have been if I'd known then what I know now about surviving in the wilderness." Terrence seemed worldly, confident. "He spoke of opportunities in the East, of the life we would build together." She shook her head at her own naivety. "I wanted to believe him. Perhaps I saw what I wished to see." "We all make mistakes," Ryder said gently. "It's what we learn from them that matters." Penelope nodded, picking up her mending again. "I've learned I'm stronger than I ever knew, that I can survive things I once thought would break me." She met his gaze. "I have you to thank for that." "No," Ryder said firmly. "The strength was always in you. I just helped you find it." As February gave way to March, subtle changes began to appear in the landscape. The snow remained deep, but the quality of light shifted, the days lengthening perceptibly. Birds that had been absent for months returned, their calls a welcome break in the winter silence. "Spring will come early this year," Ryder predicted one morning as they watched a pair of robins searching for nesting materials. "Another month, maybe less, and the passes will start to clear." The statement, factual as it was, carried an undercurrent of something else, a reminder that their time together had always been temporary. Once the snow melted, Penelope would be able to travel to Spokane Falls, to rejoin civilization and rebuild her life. The thought, which once would have brought nothing but relief, now filled her with a strange melancholy. "What will you do?" she asked, watching Ryder's profile as he gazed at the distant mountains. "When spring comes." He was silent for a long moment. "Originally planned to stake a claim up here. Build a proper cabin, start trapping again." He hesitated. "Now I'm not so sure." Penelope's heart beat faster. "Oh, what's changed?" Ryder turned to look at her, his expression unguarded for once. "Everything," he said simply. The word hung between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. Penelope found herself unable to hold his gaze, her cheeks warming despite the cool air. "I should check the snares," Ryder said finally, breaking the charged silence. "We're running low on meat." Penelope nodded, watching as he gathered his rifle and snowshoes. Only when he had disappeared into the trees did she release the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Everything had indeed changed. Somewhere during these months of shared hardship and quiet companionship, Penelope had come to care deeply for this solitary, honorable man who had saved her life. Not with the giddy infatuation she'd once felt for Terrence, but with something deeper, built on respect and shared experiences. But what future could there be for them? Ryder was a man of the wilderness, most at home in these remote mountains. She was a city woman who had learned to adapt to survive, but could she truly choose this life permanently? These questions occupied her mind as she went about her chores, stoking the fire and preparing a stew from their dwindling supplies. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Ryder's return until the door opened, bringing a gust of cold air. "Found fresh tracks," he said, stomping snow from his boots. "Deer heading down toward the valley, good sign that spring's coming." Penelope nodded, trying to muster enthusiasm. "That's wonderful news." Ryder hung his rifle on the pegs by the door, then turned to study her. "Doesn't sound like you think it's wonderful." She busied herself with the stew, afraid to meet his eyes. "Of course it is. Who wouldn't be happy about the end of winter?" Ryder moved closer, gently turning her to face him. "Penelope," he said, his voice soft but insistent, "talk to me." She looked up at him, seeing concern in his eyes. "I'm being foolish," she admitted. "All these months I've been focused on surviving until spring. Now that it's almost here, I realize I don't know what comes after." "What do you want to come after?" Ryder asked, his hands still lightly holding her shoulders. The question was simple but profound. What did she want? Not to return to Portland, where memories of her failed marriage would follow her. Not to start over alone in Spokane Falls, a town of strangers. "I want." She began, then faltered. "I don't want to leave here, not yet, not." She took a deep breath. "Not without you." The admission hung in the air between them. Ryder's hands tightened slightly on her shoulders, his eyes searching hers. "I've been alone most of my life," he said slowly. "Thought that's how I preferred it. Then you came along stubborn, brave, refusing to give up even when the odds were stacked against you." A small smile touched his lips. "Made me realize what I've been missing all these years." Hope bloomed in Penelope's chest. "And what's that?" "Partnership," Ryder said simply. "Someone to share the good days and help weather the bad ones. Someone who sees me as I am and chooses to stay anyway." He released her shoulders, taking a step back. "I won't pretend I have much to offer. I'm not a wealthy man. This life," he gestured around the cabin, "it's hard, especially for a woman used to city comforts." "Do I look like a woman who needs city comforts?" Penelope challenged, gesturing to her homespun dress and calloused hands. "I've survived a winter in the wilderness. I've learned to hunt, to build, to live off the land." "Yes, you have," Ryder acknowledged, pride evident in his voice. "Better than most men I've known." "Then don't speak to me of what I might miss," she said firmly. "Speak to me of what you want." Ryder's expression softened. "What I want is simple, Penelope. I want you to stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose this life. With me." The words, plainly spoken but filled with emotion, were exactly what she needed to hear. No flowery declarations or grand promises, just honest truth. "And if I choose to stay?" she asked, her heart pounding. Ryder moved closer again, one hand rising to cup her cheek. "Then I'd ask you to be my wife, to build a life here together." Penelope leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Is that a proposal, Ryder Wells?" A smile broke across his face, transforming his usually serious features. "I believe it is, Penelope Vail, though I'd hoped to have a ring or at least a better cabin to offer when the time came." "I don't need a ring," she said softly, "and we built this cabin together. That makes it more precious to me than any grand house could ever be." Ryder's smile widened. "Is that a yes?" In answer, Penelope rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Ryder's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him. When they finally parted, both were breathless. That, Penelope said, her cheeks flushed, was most definitely a yes. The remaining weeks of winter passed in a haze of happiness. They continued their daily routines of survival, but now there was a new purpose to their work, planning for a future together. They spoke of improvements to the cabin, of planting a garden when the ground thawed, of building a proper barn for the animals they hoped to acquire. "We should go to Spokane Falls when the pass is clear," Ryder said one evening as they lay side by side in what was now their shared bed. "Get properly married by a preacher, stock up on supplies we can't make ourselves. And what will you tell the preacher when he asks how we met?" Penelope teased, nestling closer to his warmth. Ryder chuckled. the sound rumbling pleasantly against her ear. "That I found a half-frozen city woman in my mountains and was fool enough to take her in. And I'll tell him I was desperate enough to trust a bearded mountain man who looked like he'd been raised by bears." "Bears have better manners," Ryder protested, earning a playful slap on his chest. These light-hearted moments were new to their relationship, a layer of joy atop the foundation of respect and shared hardship they'd built through the winter. March brought the promised thaw. Snow began to recede from the clearing around the cabin, revealing muddy ground and the first tentative shoots of early spring plants. The stream ran high with snowmelt, its rushing sound a constant backdrop to their days. By early April, Ryder deemed the lower passes navigable. "We could make it to Spokane Falls in 3 days if the weather holds," he said, studying the terrain from the ridge above their cabin. Penelope nodded, a mixture of excitement and trepidation filling her. She had not seen another human face besides Ryder's in over 6 months. The prospect of returning to civilization, even temporarily, felt strange. "Will we come back here afterward?" she asked, gesturing to their small homestead. "If that's what you want," Ryder replied, "though we might want to consider building a bigger cabin." "This one was meant for survival, not comfort." Penelope smiled, slipping her hand into his. "I've found comfort has more to do with the company than the accommodations." Ryder squeezed her hand, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Nonetheless, a proper lady deserves a proper home. One with a wooden floor from the start and maybe even glass windows." "Such luxury," she teased. "Next you'll be suggesting indoor plumbing and electric lights." "Let's not get carried away," Ryder laughed, "but perhaps a separate bedroom wouldn't be amiss. Especially if we're to have little ones someday." The casual mention of children sent a warm flush through Penelope. They had spoken of marriage but not yet of family. The idea of children's sons with Ryder's steady strength, daughters with his kind eyes, filled her with longing she hadn't expected. "I'd like that," she said softly. "A home filled with children, our children." Ryder's expression softened as he pulled her into his arms. "So would I," he murmured against her hair, "more than I realized until just now." They set out for Spokane Falls 3 days later, carrying only essential supplies and the few personal items they possessed. Ryder had fashioned a crude lock for the cabin door, though he admitted it was more symbolic than practical. "Not many folks pass through these parts," he explained. "And those who do generally respect another man's property." The journey was arduous but not unpleasant. Spring had firmly taken hold in the lower elevations, painting the landscape with fresh green and early wildflowers. Game was plentiful, and they ate well each night at their campsites. Penelope found herself growing anxious as they neared civilization. She had changed so much during the winter months. Would she still know how to behave in town? Would people look askance at her rough clothing and calloused hands? "You're fretting," Ryder observed on their final night before reaching Spokane Falls. "I can hear your thoughts churning from here." Penelope smiled ruefully. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's watched you face down blizzards and illness without blinking." He reached across the campfire to take her hand. "What's troubling you?" "I'm not the woman who left Portland," she admitted. "I've changed in ways I never imagined possible. I wonder if I'll fit into town life at all now." Ryder considered this. "We're not going to stay in town," he reminded her gently. "Just long enough to get married proper and gather supplies." "I know, it's foolish." "Not foolish," Ryder corrected. "Natural, but remember this: the strength you found in those mountains didn't come from nowhere. It was always in you, waiting to be discovered." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "That strength will serve you well wherever you go, Penelope, town or wilderness." His words, as always, went straight to the heart of her concerns. This was what she valued most about Ryder, his ability to see past pretense to the core of a matter. "Thank you," she said simply. "Besides," he added with a rare grin, "if anyone gives you trouble, just remind them you survived a Rocky Mountain winter with nothing but your wits and a grumpy trapper for company." Spokane Falls proved to be smaller than Penelope had expected, a frontier town still in its infancy, with wooden sidewalks fronting simple clapboard buildings. Still, after months of seeing no human face but Ryder's, The bustle of people along the main street seemed overwhelming. They drew curious glances as they made their way toward the hotel Ryder with his buckskins and full beard, Penelope in her homespun dress, both showing the weathered look of people who had lived rough. "Feels strange," Ryder muttered, eyeing the crowded street with discomfort. "Too many people." Penelope squeezed his arm reassuringly. "We won't stay long," she promised. The hotel owner, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Holloway, raised her eyebrows at the sight of them, but asked no questions beyond whether they wanted one room or two. "Two," Ryder said firmly, despite Penelope's surprised glance. "Adjoining, if possible." Once alone in her room, a simple space but luxurious after their cabin, Penelope understood Ryder's insistence. If they were to be properly married, they would observe the proprieties until then. A bath was her first priority. The hotel offered the service for an additional fee, and Penelope nearly wept at the sensation of hot water and soap after months of makeshift washing in frigid stream water. She washed her hair 3 times, marveling at how it shone once clean. Afterward, wrapped in a borrowed robe while her clothes were being laundered, she heard a knock at the door connecting her room to Ryder's. "Decent," his voice called. "Yes," she answered, tightening the robe around herself. Ryder entered, freshly bathed himself, his beard trimmed and hair cut. The transformation was striking beneath the wilderness grime. He was a remarkably handsome man, with strong features and intelligent eyes. "You look different," she said, unable to keep the appreciation from her voice. "Feel different," he admitted, running a hand self-consciously over his trimmed beard. "Figured I should look presentable for our wedding." He paused, studying her with equal appreciation. "You look beautiful." Penelope blushed, aware of her damp hair and borrowed robe. "I've nothing to wear but my old dress," she fretted. "Hardly appropriate for a bride." "I took the liberty of arranging something," Ryder said, a hint of nervousness in his tone. The dressmaker across the street had a ready-made dress that might suit. "Said she could adjust it by tomorrow if you're amenable." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Penelope nodded. "That's very kind, but Ryder, I have no money to pay for such things." He waved away her concern. "I've been trapping these mountains for years with little to spend my earnings on. I have enough saved." The next day was a flurry of activity. The dress, a simple but elegant blue woolen garment, fit Penelope perfectly after the dressmaker's adjustments. Ryder purchased a new suit, looking both handsome and uncomfortable in the formal attire. The preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Jenkins, agreed to perform the ceremony that afternoon. When Penelope explained their unusual situation, leaving out the more intimate details, he merely nodded. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said with a gentle smile. "Bringing 2 souls together in the wilderness speaks of divine intervention to my mind." The ceremony was small, just the 2 of them, the Reverend, and Mrs. Holloway and her husband as witnesses. But as Penelope stood before Ryder, speaking vows to love and cherish him for all her days, she felt the moment was perfect in its simplicity. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Jenkins declared. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Wells." Ryder's kiss was gentle but full of promise, his hands warm as they cradled her face. When they parted, both were smiling, a shared joy that needed no words. They spent a week in Spokane Falls, purchasing supplies for their return to the mountains, seeds for a garden, tools for expanding the cabin, fabric for curtains and bedding, books to while away future winter evenings. Ryder even found a small glass window to install in their cabin, a luxury that made Penelope laugh with delight. "Now we're becoming positively civilized," she teased as he carefully wrapped the precious pain in blankets for transport. On their final night in town, they dined at the hotel's small restaurant, enjoying food they hadn't tasted in months: fresh bread, beef that wasn't game, vegetables that hadn't been dried or preserved. "Will you miss this?" Ryder asked, watching as Penelope savored a bite of apple pie. The comforts of town, she considered the question honestly. Some things, perhaps fresh bread, conversation with other women. She reached across the table to take his hand. "But not enough to outweigh what we have in our mountains." "Our mountains," Ryder repeated, satisfaction in his tone. "I like the sound of that." The journey back took longer. their pack horses laden with supplies. Penelope found herself eager to return to see their little cabin and begin transforming it from a survival shelter to a true home. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking their clearing, Penelope felt a surge of emotion. The cabin looked small and crude from this distance, but to her eyes, it was more welcoming than any grand house could ever be. "Home," she said softly. Ryder's arms slipped around her waist. "Home," he agreed. The following months were filled with hard work and profound contentment. They expanded the cabin, adding a second room and replacing the dirt floor with proper planking. Ryder installed the glass window in their bedroom, positioning it to catch the morning sun. Penelope planted a garden, coaxing vegetables from the mountain soil with determined patience. She learned to preserve the bounty of late summer for the winter months ahead, filling shelves with jars of pickled vegetables and wild berry preserves. By autumn, the transformation was complete. Their cabin, while still modest, had become a true home, warm, comfortable, filled with small touches that reflected both their personalities. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch Ryder had built that summer, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Penelope felt a completeness she had never known before. "Are you happy here?" Ryder asked, his arm around her shoulders as they shared a blanket against the evening chill. Penelope considered the question, thinking of the life she had once led in Portland, comfortable but constrained, defined by society's expectations rather than her own choices. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "I was so afraid when Terrence left me here. I thought it was the end of my life." She leaned against Ryder's solid warmth. Instead, it was just the beginning. Ryder pressed a kiss to her temple. "For both of us," he said softly. "For both of us." As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Penelope stood at the window of their snug cabin, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew. Behind her, Ryder stoked the fire. The familiar domestic sounds a counterpoint to the gathering storm outside. 1 year ago, abandoned and facing certain death, she could never have imagined the life that awaited her. A life built with her own hands alongside the man she loved. A life of challenge and reward, of hardship and profound joy. The mountains that had nearly claimed her life had given her something far greater: the discovery of her own strength, the love of a good man, and the promise of a future richer than any she could have planned. Outside, the snow fell harder, blanketing their little homestead in pristine white. But this winter, unlike the last, brought no fear, only anticipation of cozy evenings by the fire, of planning for their child's spring arrival, of deepening the bond that had been forged in the harshest conditions. Ryder came to stand beside her, his arm encircling her waist as they watched the snow together. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured. "Yes," Penelope agreed, leaning back against his chest. "Beautiful because we're facing it together." In the gathering twilight, their cabin glowed with warmth and light, a beacon of hope and love in the vast wilderness. Proof that even in the most unlikely circumstances, home could be found, and a heart once abandoned could learn to trust again. As night fell completely, Ryder led her gently away from the window, closing the curtains against the storm. Tomorrow would bring chores and challenges, but tonight was theirs alone, husband and wife, partners in all things, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the mountains themselves. And in that moment, Penelope knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she truly belonged. Not in the polite society of Portland or the growing frontier town of Spokane Falls, but here in a cabin built by loving hands, beside a man whose quiet strength had shown her the best version of herself. The wilderness that had once seemed so threatening had become home, and the winter that had once promised death now heralded only the season's natural sleep, a prelude to spring's inevitable renewal and the new life that would join their family. "I love you, Ryder Wells," she said simply, turning in his arms to face him. His smile, warm and tender in the firelight, was all the answer she needed. But he spoke the words anyway, words that had once seemed impossible for the solitary mountain man. "And I love you, Penelope Wells. Until my last breath and beyond." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside their cabin, all was warmth and light and love, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the healing power of love, even in the harshest wilderness.